Chapter 14, you're in the home stretch. Standardized tests and accountability. So what our main questions are, what our guiding questions are right now are, what are standardized tests and how are they used? What types of standardized tests are given? How are they interpreted? What are some issues concerning standardized tests? And how are educators held accountable for student achievement? Kind of look at like what the future of education kind of is holding right now too. So what is a standardized test? The term standardized means that they are uniform in content, administration, and scoring. Remember when you were a kid and they would say, open your book to page 2. Do not turn your book over until the proctor says turn your book over. You are to use a number 2 pencil and only a number 2 pencil. You are to bubble the circle completely. And they would, read the exact same thing. When I say go, you may turn over your booklet and you may begin. Go. That's because it would be, you want the same person to you want everybody to read it the same way and the same thing at the exact same, pretty much at the same time, because you want them to be done at the same time too. Because you can imagine some teacher would go in and go, oh, here it goes again. I got to do these stupid tests. We hate these tests. They're horrible. Don't worry about it. Everybody sucks at them. It's terrible. And then there's other ones like, oh my God, it's going to be so good. When we're done with this, we're all going to have a pizza party. I don't want you guys to worry about it at all. You rock. This is going to be wonderful. So if you do something like that, we know that that's a standardized, that we want the content and the delivery of the test to be standard, or the administration of the test to be standard. We want them to be scored the same way. That's why it takes so long to get back like your writing scores and such, because they have groups of people that have been trained to score them in a standardized way. Standardized tests allows for schools to compare, for comparisons of schools or results across classrooms, across schools, and across districts. For selection placement, a lot of times standardized tests are used. Standardized tests are often used to select students for entry or placement into specific programs, like college entrance, special programs for students who are gifted and talented, special education programs. High schools sometimes use standardized tests in deciding which kids go into college prep classes, into general classes, or sometimes into vocational classes. The U.S. government decides what kind of not the branch of a service, but what your role in the service is going to be by a standardized test. When we talk about diagnosis, standardized tests are often used to diagnose individual students' learning problems or their strengths. For example, students who perform poorly in school might have a battery of tests that they're given to determine whether they have a learning disability or maybe mental retardation. When I used to teach, we gave a standardized test, an achievement test, every single year on our students. We would do the Woodcock-Johnson achievement battery. It had a reading test, a writing test, a math test, just a basic letter test. You could do the key math test. We did all these types of assessments. There was a Woodcock-Johnson reading mastery test that had all the different types of reading, so you could see exactly and pinpoint what the students' problems in reading were. There's some very sophisticated assessments that can help you determine the kids' cognitive styles and the depth of their understanding of really complex concepts. For evaluation and accountability, we also use standardized tests. And the common application for a standardized test is for students to evaluate students' progress, teachers and schools' effectiveness. And then also we sometimes hold educators accountable for their achievement and the achievement of their students and the gains that their students make. And then the students' overall performance. Parents often want to know how their children are doing in comparison with the typical achievement of children at their grade level. So a lot of times in Florida in particular right now, we still have the value-added model, which we're going to talk about later on in the chapter, where 50% of their pay. Now I heard that it's being rescinded in the next round of legislation, but it hasn't happened yet. We also look at this for school improvement reasons, excuse my stumbling, for school improvement reasons. And one of the things that we look at is standardized tests contribute to improving the school process. The results of some standardized tests provide information about appropriate student placement and diagnostic information. maybe remediation as well. Achievement tests can guide curriculum development and revision in like weaker areas. You can look at the standardized tests. If everyone in the 4th grade is having a hard time in math, then you should look at your math curriculum. If it's just one teacher, then you look at professional development for that one teacher. So they can play a role in the guidance and counseling of students, and like what your track is. In school, you could look at a kid's standardized test scores and say, you know, the likelihood that you're going to go into advanced placement classes is not very good. Or you could look at a kid and say, you know what, you really should try going into some advanced placement classes, or maybe into some kind of higher program like IB or something like that. What types are given? There's different types of standardized tests that we can talk about. The first one that we usually talk about is that we talk about a lot is an aptitude test. An aptitude test is such things as like a general IQ test. There's multi-factor batteries, and it pretty much predicts your general ability. IQ tests are administered to individuals typically, but it can be done in a group to kind of get like a general idea of what the kids' cognitive abilities are. It's kind of like a screening. Achievement tests assess student proficiency in various subject areas, and then a diagnostic tests focus on specific subject matter that discovers strengths and weaknesses of the child and the mastery of what they're trying to master. When we talk about aptitude tests, they kind of, we talked about this already a little bit, generally your potential. When you look at an IQ test or an aptitude test, you're talking about what the child is apt to do or what the person is apt to do. They're not just IQ tests too. They can do aptitude tests even for children with learning, with mental retardation. They'll look at them like we've done aptitude tests to see how well they would do in a sheltered workshop. I thought it was pretty interesting. A friend of mine did an aptitude test on a kid of whether or not they could do well in a factory setting, to be able to like do small part work and stuff like that. And they met with the parents, and they told the parents that this child should never work in like a factory setting. And they said, why? And they said, well, his eye-hand coordination is really, really bad. And they said, really? And they said, yeah. And they said, well, do you think he could like march in a band and play the xylophone? And they go, oh no, never. And the dad said, well, don't tell him, because he's been doing it for about 5 years. And actually he was really, really good at it. And he got a music only scholarship to the University of Georgia, and he played in their marching band. So even though he was had mental retardation, he was still able to play in their band. And his aptitude, the aptitude test didn't actually score what they thought that it could score, like eye-hand coordination. Norm reference achievement tests we also look at as well. Achievement tests focus on skills and abilities that are traditionally taught in school. We talked about these in the last chapter. We talked about like the SAT, the ACT, those are norm reference achievement tests. There are also achievement batteries that we talked about a little bit already too. Diagnostic tests. There are single subject achievement test measures. The SAT offers them. Some of the Ivy League colleges and some of the other colleges require you to take at least one subject, single subject achievement measure. There are also criterion referenced achievement measures, which like the Florida, the FSA, Florida State Assessment, or some of you took the FCAT when you were younger. Those are all criterion reference achievement tests. They are also normed in the sense that they are, not normed, but standardized. Well, they actually normed too, but they're standardized so that you can, everyone gives it at the same time and with the same directions. So when we talk about criterion reference achievement tests, they differ from norm reference in several ways. Such a test can take the form of a survey, a diagnostic test, or just a single subject test. In contrast to norm reference tests, which are designed for schools with varying curricula, criterion reference tests are most meaningful when they're constructed around that one set of objectives. Remember we were talking about building a test? Criterion reference tests, you are supposed to be able to get them all right. In a norm reference test, you're not supposed to. It's supposed to kind of give you a battery so that they can figure out what you know and what you don't know. And when you develop a norm reference test, you probably remember this maybe from your ACT or your SAT test. Typically, you'll get an extra section of test questions. And what they're doing is they're norming that section. So they'll look at how you did on the questions that have been used before, and they'll look at those questions and they'll say, okay, well, this student scores at this level and they got all of these questions right. So these questions typically are at this level. And then they'll look at those same questions, and then somebody who doesn't do as well, they'll look at those. And if you got those right and they got those right, more than likely those are not good questions. And then they'll look at somebody who did really well on the test compared to somebody who just did average on the test. And if you got them right and the person that is really smart got them right and the person who's not very smart got them right, then it might be an okay question. If the really smart person got them right and you didn't get them right, or the average person didn't get them right, and then the person who's below average or low average person didn't get them right, then likely that's a good discriminatory test question, which means that this would discriminate between the kids who are really bright, if all the kids who are really bright got it right, and the kids who are just average. So that's kind of how they figure out that 800 score or that 750 score compared to the 600 or the 650 score. And so when you do a norm reference test, they don't expect everybody to get them right. That's why getting that 800 on those SAT tests or the perfect 36 on the ACT tests are really rare. Standard settings, and that's what we talked about a little bit before. When tests are used to make decisions about mastery, a procedure is employed to determine that the test cutoff scores indicate various proficiency levels. Most methods are establishing a cutoff score rely on some kind of professional judgment of teachers and educators. So one of the things that we have to look at is like on the FCAT, they have the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, the 4s, and the 5s, or the FSA. So what they're really talking about is like, what is the cutoff score which is considered to be proficient? And so they don't just take the mean of the group. They have to say, like, this is the basic of what we think all the kids should be able to score. That goes along with that. Then the base of the cutoff score for mastery or proficiency on those probabilities. So then they go up from there. If they say, like, this is the 3 and this is considered to be proficient, then they go up to the 4s and they go up to the 5s, and then they go up on writing to the 6s, but all the way up to the 5s. So they're saying, like, they kind of give you like a little range in those areas by able to say, like, what is the difference between a 3 and a 4? And it might be 1 point. Well, it is 1 point at one point or another. So you can have a high 3 or a low 4, and those are kind of arbitrary cutoff scores. Just recently, they did that with a general knowledge test and the Florida subject area exam, where they actually raised the cutoff scores because they thought that the scores were too low. And so now they have raised them, and a lot of people, like, we used to have like a 95% pass rate, and now on the first try, and now we have about, I would say, maybe a 60 or 70% pass rate on the first try. And then some people have taken it like 3 and 4 times and still not been able to pass it. So then we say, how are test scores, standardized tests, interpreted? And this is the interesting part. Students who take them usually are sent for computer scoring. A lot of tests now, like in Florida, almost everything is computer tested, but I just read some legislation that said that they were going to move away from that. But your raw scores on the test are then translated into other scores. And the 3 areas that they usually are translated into are things called percentiles, grade equivalence, and standard scores. So those of you that will someday procreate, you're going to get these test scores from your kids, and you're going to try and figure out how smart your kids are. When you get a percentile score or a percentile rank, it's indicated as a percentage of students in the norming group who scored lower than that particular score. So if you ranked a group of 30 students from bottom to top, the 25th student from the bottom would be at the 83rd percentile, or 25 out of 30, which and then you divide that by that 100 and you go through, it's 83.3. So you get, that would be your percentile rank. Typically, when you look at percentiles, it'll say something like the 83rd percentile, or the 88th percentile, or the 90th percentile, or the 99th percentile. And it kind of goes to that whole 100 thing. So they'll say, if hypothetically, if 100 kids took this test, sometimes it's way more than 100, like thousands. If 100 kids took this test, you did better than 99 of them, which means because you can't go higher than 99 because you can't be better than yourself. You also the lowest score you can get is the 1st percentile because you can never be worse than yourself. So when you're looking at percentiles, 50th percentile means you're average. If 100 kids took the test, you did better than 50 of them, which means you're right smack dab in the middle. A lot of parents freak out when they see percentile scores because they're like, oh my God, my kid scored, he scored 50%. No, he scored in the 50th percentile, which means he's very average or she is very average. Grade equivalent scores, a lot of times people get a little bit messed up on. And what it is it relates student scores to the average scores obtained by students at a particular grade level. And so a lot of times you'll get a grade equivalent score and it'll say like 5.3. Well, if your child is in the 5th grade, in the beginning of the 5th grade, then they're average because they're reading on the 5th grade, 3rd month average. And that's pretty much what it means. But a lot of times people will get them, like you'll have a 2nd grader and they'll say they're reading on an 11.2 grade level. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, watch out, Harvard, here they come. Because you think your child is reading on 11th grade level. But actually they're a rough estimation, and really what it means is if an 11th grader was to take that 1st grade test, that's how high they would score. So for example, if an average student gains 1 equivalent each year, we call that progressing at the right grade level. However, your 1st grader is not really reading on 11th grade level. Are they doing well? Yes. Should you think they're doing really well and be kind of excited because you got a really smart kid? Yes. So if a child's in 5th grade and they read at a 3.5 grade level, then you know that would be like a 3rd grader taking that 5th grade test. But it also means that your kid's probably behind. Standard scores are kind of scores several kinds of scores describe tests according to their position on a normal curve. Normal curve is similar to percentile scores, but not exactly. A normal curve describes a distribution of scores in which most fall near the mean or average, and then they kind of systematically or use symmetry to go from the mean out to its ends. And we usually look at that. The normal distribution follows the bell curve, and you've seen me draw the bell curve many times during the course of a semester. So here's a bell curve, and so what it's really saying is most of the average clusters around the middle. So we're going to have the middle score, the mean, that they cluster around the mean. And then as you go out to the ends, it gets less and less and less because you have very few people that are doing really, really well and very few people that are doing really poorly. So you got to have this nice bell curve. According to statistics, everything falls into a bell curve. And if they don't, then we do some kind of magic number and put it through a little magic number box, and then it turns into a bell curve. Sometimes you will have something called a bimodal curve, which means that like some kids will do really poorly and then some kids will do really well. So you have like 2 curves that go along. And that's when you have to kind of say, what's going on with my class here? But when we use a standard score and we're looking at the normal distribution, we look at something called stanines. Stanines are based on the standard deviations of a score. And what we're really saying is how far away from the mean did this student score? If you're 1 standard deviation below the mean, then you're still within the average range. If you're 1 standard deviation above the mean, you're still within the average range. If you're 2 standard deviations below the mean, you're in the low average range, and it's a little bit concerning. If you're 2 standard deviations above the mean, then you're in the high area, and then you're doing well. When we look at normal curve equivalence, it's based on comparison scores within the normal distribution. So how close are you to that mean? So you're kind of comparing yourself to where you fall on it. When you get a z-score, what you're actually looking at is kind of like, because not every single test has the exact same number of questions, and they don't have the same standard error of measurement, so how much they would expect a child to get wrong or right on any other given day, they turn something into a z-score. Z-scores are also based on the normal equivalency. It's just a conversion score, so that it's at the 0 is that you're at the mean. +1 would mean you're 1 standard deviation above the mean. -1 would be 1 standard deviation below. +2 would be 2 above. -2 would be 2 below. Anytime you go beyond 2 standard deviations above or below the mean, it means that you're kind of getting into the the kind of wacky area. If you're 2 standard deviations below the mean, that means you're not doing well, and that it's really a warning signal. If you're 2 standard deviations above the mean, it usually means you're doing really, really well, and that we should probably look at pushing this kid farther and into some kind of gifted program or something like that. So this is kind of why it looks like this. If you look at the standard deviation, if you're a half of a standard deviation, 38.3% of the population fall right in here when they take any kind of standard test. They're going to fall right there above or below the mean, about a half a standard deviation. If you're 1 standard deviation above or below the mean, 68.3% of the population are 1 standard deviation either above and below the mean. In that dark green area on that chart, it will show you that that means that that is really average, that you can consider yourself right there in the middle of the pack. You're average. Up to 2 standard deviations above or below the mean is still within the normal range, but look at that, 95.4% of the population ends up being within 2 standard deviations above the mean. So if you were to take any 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 kids and you were to put them on a standardized test like that, 95.4% of them would fall within 2 standard deviations above or below the mean. And then it's 3 standard deviations above or below the mean. It's at 99.8% of the population. So when you're really scoring, like if we were to look at this like the ACT scores, the SAT scores, if you had an 800, you would be well over 3 standard deviations over the mean, which means that you're at the 0.2% of the population. And so even if you get like a 750 or something like that, you're still like 3 standard deviations above the mean, which means that you're like between 95.4 and 99.8% of the population. So it really is one of those pretty strong predictors of how well you're going to do. And I'll show you in a minute because we have the different tests and how they do it. Here's the SAT that goes along with it. So raw scores, that would be your percent, just your percent correct. If you're 85% correct, you're 3 standard deviations above the mean. So typically when you're doing a raw score, that's what it's looking like. I told you Z-scores, it's just converts everything like that to 0, 1, 2, 3. Stanines are a little bit different. I call it the seesaw effect. 5 is considered to be average, and it's kind of easy to talk to parents about that. 3 means that you're a little bit below average, but you're still within you're still within the normal range, but you're kind of teetering on Warning Will Robinson from 1 to 3. When you have 4, 5, 3, 4, 5, 5 is average. So 4 would be you're doing good. If you're on a teeter-totter, you're keeping that teeter-totter right afloat because you're not too far away from the middle. 6, same thing. You're not too far away from the middle, but you're doing a little bit better than most everybody else. When you get into 7, that means you're getting closer to the blue sky 7. And then if you have 9, you're right up there. You're doing really well. IQ, this is another one we look at. 100, average is 100. Your IQ is 100. If you have an IQ of 115, you're considered to be above average. You're right there bordering above average. Anything over 115 and below 130 is considered to be high average. If you're over 130 degrees, 2 standard deviations, which in order to be in a gifted program, you have to pretty much score over 130 in most states. That means you're better than 95%, you're smarter than 95% of the population. That is 2 standard deviations above. And then if you're 3 standard deviations above, those rare kids that have an IQ of over 145, they are at that 0.2% of the population. If you look at the SAT scores, 3 standard deviation is that perfect 800. But if you're over 700, then you're falling between 2 and 3 standard deviations, which you're getting into like the 96th, 97th percentile. 96, 90, not percentile, but 96 or 97, almost 98% of the population, depending on how close you get to that 800. When you look at this chart, it's really hard to see right here. You'll see that this is kind of the same type of report that you would get home as a parent. And it kind of shows the different types of equivalencies that you have, and it will tell you like this norm reference score, and it will say like reading, language arts, mathematics. I think that's total reading. I'm not sure what those two say. Maybe social studies and science. I'm not positive. It's real tiny. But if you look over here on the right hand side, and you'll see this gray box in the middle, that's what's considered to be average. Like that would be your mean. That goes along with this. And you can see if this direct line here, it shows you that the kid is, this student, whoever this is, somebody Jones, has scores above the mean in everything. So this child is doing well. But see these little lines right here? Those are your standard error of measurement lines, which means that that child on any given day, they're saying on this day, this is where that child scored. But knowing what the standard error is, what we can kind of do plus or minus so many based on the test and its reliability and validity, we can say that usually like they'll say your IQ is 127 plus or minus 3. Or they might say your IQ is, 118 plus or minus 5, depending on what test is given to you. And they usually know that ahead of time, what the plus or minus is on each one of these subtests. So this child right here is really close to the mean on language, but they could be at the bottom of it, but they could be well above it as well. So all that tells you is that the child should fall within somewhere on any day. If this test is reliable, they will fall somewhere within that band of confidence is what they call it. And this one gives a little more detailed, Terra Nova, a little more detailed profile about each of the subcategories and sub areas. So parents should be able to get a pretty good idea. And I'm not sure exactly what this bottom one is on this child right here, but it looks like these two are okay, and then these two are a little bit low in whatever that subject area. I should find it in the book, and I should be able to read it better. I don't see it actually. Oh yeah, here it is. It's on page 395, and I can't read it in the book either, so you're gonna have a hard time with that. All right. So what are some issues concerning standardized tests and classroom testing? The use of standardized tests to assess teachers, schools, and districts has increased. Oh my goodness, we have to do it every year. You definitely have to do it. It used to be a No Child Left Behind. You had to do it in 4th, 8th, and before they graduated high school. So they usually gave it in 10th. Then Obama came along, and he wanted it done a little bit more often, and he ended up rewriting Every Student Succeeds Act. And they kind of left it up to the states, but then they dangled this money out there called Race to the Top. And if you did more testing or you had more accountability, then you got more money. So a lot of schools did the Race to the Top. Florida was one of them. So now all states have some kind of statewide testing program. And we also, which we're going to get to in a second, have all adopted the Common Core. So in recent years, there's been a lot of developments and proposals for change. Your book actually goes into a lot of the Bush and then some of the Obama, because it was printed during that time, or it went to press before all that came out. And now we're going to have to deal with Trump's trying to rewrite a bunch of Obamas. So I can tell you a little bit about Obamas, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what Trump is going to do. One of the things that we have to look at is test validity. How valid is the test? Does the test measure what it's supposed to measure? What are those inferences that we can make by that test? And one of the things that we know is it should measure whatever your standards are. So in Florida, it's your Sunshine State standards. And the types of evidence that are used to evaluate validity are a lot of different. They're very different. You can have test validity by having experts in the field look at the test questions and look at the test items and say, are they valid? You can use another test, like we've sometimes used how kids have done on previous FCAT tests, and then we've come up with a new test. I already told you that's how they do it with the ACT, is they kind of norm test questions based on previous answers. So they can say, well, if you did really well on this test, if you did it on ones that were already normed, and you did well on this part of this test, then it's considered valid. So like with IQ tests, they'll usually give you a validity score. If I did the Stanford Binet IQ test, a lot of times they'll test the kid on the Stanford Binet, or an adult too, or the Wechsler IQ test. And so then they compare the scores. Did they get close scores? Like, were they similar? So that's a different type of validity. Sometimes they'll do retest validity, where they'll give you, they'll have a test of like maybe 100 questions, and they'll give you 50 of them will be on Form A and 50 of them will be on Form B. And so they'll look to compare Form A to Form B to see if the test scores are similar. So all of those things tell us that that test is measuring what it's supposed to measure, and it's valid. The unfortunate thing we're having right now with Florida on the new FSA is our test was normed in Utah, which is really kind of weird, because that means kids in Utah took that test. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think a lot of Mormon kids in Utah are real similar to kids from Miami, let's say, or Homestead. So it really does, when you do a norming sample, you try to make it as close to the population as you are that are going to take the test. So then we have test reliability. And reliability means if I were to give the test more than once, would I get the same answer? So the reliability of the test relates to the accuracy with which the skills and knowledge are measured. When a test is administered, aspects related to the test and its administration can cause the results to be inaccurate. So in theory, if a student were to take the equivalent test twice, he should obtain the same score twice. Kind of like if you're taking your temperature, and you take your temperature and you have a 99.4, we'll just say a little fever. And then, you're like, I can't believe I have a temperature. So you hit the button again and you take it again and it's 99.4. And you hit the button again and you take it again and it's 99.4. And you're like, oh crap, I kind of have I'm running a low grade fever. So with tests, that's pretty much what it should be like as well. Random features of the assessment that can affect test scores are ambiguous test items where kids guess. If kids are guessing, then it's not a good test question because they're all guessing and each kid can guess differently depending on how many times it's been administered. Differences in specific item content. So sometimes you'll get a test and it doesn't measure exactly what was taught. Recently, I was talking to some teachers and they said, I forget what it was. It was like regrouping, two-digit regrouping. And they had to do it 3 different ways. But anyways, in the test, they had like 3-digit regrouping and then, I don't know, a 3-digit division. I don't remember exactly what it was. But whatever it was, it wasn't something that was on their standard, but yet it was on the test. So that the difference in the specific item content, what was on the test and what was taught, are different. So that's not a reliable test. When we talked about ambiguous test items, then you get into lucky or unlucky guessing. Some kids that are just really lucky. And then you also have inconsistent motivation. You might just have some kids that are just not motivated, or one kids were promised, a pizza party afterwards and the other kids were not. And then we have the huge one of test anxiety. Kids have become really, really anxious about tests. And so a lot of kids are getting test anxiety and they're just forgetting what they were, what they learned. And so it's not an accurate measure and you're not going to get reliable results from it. Another thing that we have to worry about with tests is test bias. And a lot of teachers talk about this, that there are biases between some kids in low income and diverse backgrounds. There was some tests that I looked at previously in previous years, and there wasn't any children of color in it, and they had common items that you would look at maybe in a middle class home that might not be in a low income home. Kind of like I was telling you the story a few chapters back about the little boy that didn't know that milk came from a cow because he had never been to a farm and had no idea. He just thought it came from 7-Eleven and a milk factory. So a test that gives unfair advantage to one another or a category of students cannot be considered valid. And we've tried to create valid free tests, and it's really hard. Like, how do you test a nonverbal child? Well, there is such a thing as a nonverbal test, but is it as reliable and invalid as a verbal test? And can you compare that child that's nonverbal with a child that is verbal? And it's probably the greatest concern is the possibility that tests could be biased because the items assess knowledge and skills that are common to one group or culture but not to another. And that's one of the things that you have to worry about. There's this new thing called computerized test administration, and the use of computers to administer tests is becoming more and more common. In Florida right now, that's it. You are tested on the computer. And it's the simple form, same multiple choice items in the same order, and they're presented to students in a typical paper and pencil test. The kind of nice thing about the computerized test is that there's nobody there to kind of like walk around and give kids a little nod on the head or anything like that, because there's no feedback. All the feedback is generic to the computer. But there's these new cool ones. If you've ever taken like the GRE, or sometimes they're the ACT or SAT, possibly online, they have computer adaptive tests. And there's something called a basal and a ceiling. And the basal is the lowest number that you got correct, that were all correct. So like, let's say I started you out, you're taking a GRE test, and I would start you out maybe at question 15 or 20. If you get 3 correct in a row, at 15 you get 16, 17, and 18 correct, they are going to assume that you got 1 through 15 correct. And if you didn't, let's say you got 15 and 16 correct, but you got 17 and 18 incorrect, then what they do is they'll drop you down to 10, and then they'll go 10, 11, 12, and they do all the way back up to question 18. If you didn't get them all correct at 10, like 3 correct in a row at 10, then they'll drop you back down to 0. But they usually start you out a little bit higher up, and then it will adjust. So let's say you do get 15, 16, 17, 18 correct. You got your basal, 3 or 4 in a row. You got your basal line. Then it will skip you up. It will skip you past 20, and it will go up to 30 or 25. It depends on the test. It'll go up to 30. And then 30 will go, if you score 31, 32, and 33 correct, then it will skip you up to 40. And it will assume, it gives you credit for all those questions that you didn't answer. The bottom number where you started at is called your basal. The top number where you reach, once you get like 2 out of 3 wrong, sometimes it's 5 out of 6, it depends on, 3 out of 6, it depends on the test. Once you get those numbers wrong, then that's considered your ceiling. You've hit the ceiling. And so what it actually does is allow teachers and students to go much quicker through a test than they normally would, because they're skipping so many questions. And they're giving you a pretty good estimate of what the child knows and doesn't know. And it actually can be somewhat false, because you could have missed one question in between there, but it gives you credit for it anyway. So harder items follow correct responses, and the easier items are presented after wrong answers. So it kind of skips you down. And it gives you a running estimate of the student's performance over the entire test, and is continuously updated. So a lot of times, like, I've had people go, wow, that was a really fast test. But what really happened was they skipped really far ahead, or else they bombed out and they did really poorly. And you hit your ceiling at a much lower level. When we look at kids in ESE and testing accommodations for students with disability, some kinds of accommodations that we can do, and it's really important. There was one school that I worked with that the principal made sure every single accommodation on the kid's IEP was met during the testing, and the kids' scores went up dramatically. So some of the accommodations are enlarging tests for students with vision problems. Some of the far more controversial ones are with kids with learning disabilities, are like extended time or double time, or reading items to the kids. You can't read reading, like if it's a reading test, you can't read those ones to them. But for science, you're looking for content. For social studies, you're looking for content. For mathematics, you're looking for content. So it's okay to read the items for them. Researchers have found that extending testing time increases scores for all students, not just students with disabilities. But students with disabilities benefit much more than the other students, so that if a regular ed kid increased their score, it would, had increased time, it would increase their score, but it doesn't increase it as much as the kids with special ed who need the extra time. Reading items to students, however, is primarily beneficial to just for kids with learning disabilities. ELL kids, English language learner kids, have testing accommodations as well. A lot of the No Child Left Behind, it used to, and I'm pretty sure in ESSA it does as well. It focuses on accountability for achievement of all, yes it does, definitely, for all subgroups. So what they actually do is they look at the quartiles of the students, and they say, like, who are my lowest performing quartile, and typically they'll look at all the subgroups. They look at your ESE kids. Are they making adequate gains? They look at your ELL kids, your English language learner kids. Are they making adequate gains? And so they're kind of looking at all that kind of stuff. Students who speak no English cannot respond meaningful to English tests. So accommodations that they can do is rewrite the test with simplified instructions. They provide extra time, and sometimes they'll present the test in 2 languages at the same time. And other times they'll provide kids with like a English-Spanish dictionary or some kind of translation device. This has changed a lot of how educators are held accountable for student learning, but there's a huge growing trend in this. Kentucky, for example, based on the kids' test scores, if you have 1 year where your kids flatline, it's kind of like a warning and it sends up a little red flag. And that means like if they were learning on a good profile, oh, wait a minute, let me get my pen. If they were learning like this and they were expected to keep learning and then they hit your class and they flatline, they're going to say 1 year, oh, you might have had a bad group of kids. Maybe they weren't the brightest bulbs in the box. But if a second group of kids come along and they're learning fine, they're learning fine, and then they flatline out again, then you're on warning and you're on probation. Because that means hitting your class means that they're not making the learning gains that they're supposed to be making. And so then they'll put you on some kind of success plan. And by year 3, if those kids don't start making some kind of gains, and at least it's got to be going up, but they really should be going up in a positive line, then you could lose your job. So standardized tests have become really high stakes, not just for educators, but also for students, because like in 3rd grade, most kids are retained, at least in the state of Florida and many other states as well. They will retain them if they don't score proficient at reading at a proficiency level of 3 or higher in reading.